Hey y'all, welcome back to Most of It, and welcome to the 1000 subscriber special. For those of you that have yet to notice my genius, in this video I will be covering the 1000 Suns, thus 1000 sub special. Ahaha. But in all seriousness, thank y'all so much. This isn't a number I ever thought we'd hit, and especially not this fast. We all have a limited time in this world, so the fact that so many would choose to spend even a little of theirs watching something I made is truly humbling. Thank you for your support and for helping me build a community where we just talk about most things that we find interesting. But anyway, the Thousand Sons are one of the most important groups in 40k in my opinion. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that their actions have shaped the galaxy to at least some degree. But who are the Thousand Sons, and what are their tactics and legion culture like? Well, I'm here to answer those questions today, so without further ado, let's get into this. The Thousand Sons began their existence under ill omens. They were created just like the other legions, with the Emperor taking initiates and loading them up with new organs and gene seed from their Primarch, in the 15th case Magnus the Red. But during the first wave's creation, a warp storm would pop up, causing a lot of violent psychic activity in the area. Already, it seemed, the warp hungered for these soldiers. Due to the nature of their Primarch, initiates for the Thousand Sons were pretty much all psychers, with Magnus's gene seed enhancing their sometimes latent abilities. The Emperor would give the 15th a name, and unlike most legions, that name would be what they stuck with for their whole existence. Their legion name was the Thousand Sons, due to the fact that the Emperor had made 1,000 of them. Now, this may seem pretty small for a legion, and you're right, but this was because the requirements for the initiates were so high, with them all having to be compatible with Magnus's gene seed. Just like the other legions, the Thousand Sons helped clear out pockets of resistance in Terra and the Sol system, and then they would shoot out into the stars to fight in the Great Crusade. Throughout the early years of the Crusade, they would fight just like the other legions, but soon the legionaries' psychic abilities began developing more and they started using them more. This was not the boon that it appeared to be, because quickly after this, the Thousand Sons began losing men to rapid degenerative mutations. This would come to be known as the Flesh Change, which was believed to be some kind of flaw in Magnus's gene seed, which caused the Thousand Sons, typically after exerting themselves psychically, to mutate and grow arms and eyes and essentially become Chaos Spawn. The Flesh Change would become almost an epidemic for the 15th, with them having to put down or seal those afflicted in stasis caskets in hopes that they would one day find a cure. All of this mutation nonsense also made some of the Primarchs that had been found at this point try to censor the 15th, as their nature seemingly went against what the Imperium and the Great Crusade stood for. But the Thousand Sons continued losing many warriors until eventually there was discussion that they would be disbanded or destroyed altogether. Things weren't looking great for them, but at this point a light would appear as the Crusade's fleet stumbled upon the world of Prospero. This was the world Magnus the Red had crashed into, and it was seemingly tailor-made for him. Prospero was a world of psychers, so of course the Primarch fit right in. He was raised and taught by a man named Ammon, and to use his abilities, but as Primarchs do, Magnus quickly surpassed his master. The Primarch was able to destroy a race of psychic parasites that were preying on the planet's population, and probably most unique of all, unlike the other Primarchs, Magnus remembered everything from his creation to being cast into the warp, and he and the Emperor even psychically spoke on occasions before his arrival. By the time the Emperor showed up on Prospero, Magnus had made it into a paradise world, and not just by the standards of 40k. Even in our universe, Prospero would still be a pretty nice place to live. Having spoken before, the Emperor and Magnus recognized each other immediately, and they did the standard found Primarch things. You know, hey son, good to see you, here's your legion, I'm going home, and the Emperor left. By this point, almost every Marine in the 15th was afflicted with the Flesh Change, and looking to their Primarch for a solution. Magnus would look deep into the warp and would find an entity offering salvation, but it would cost the Primarch one of his eyes. Magnus would sacrifice his eye to save his legion, which at this point only had about 1,000 Marines left. Not knowing what their father had done, only that it worked, the 15th now had a second chance. They would begin recruiting from Prospero and then set out to continue conquering, this time alongside their Primarch. If the Thousand Sons used Psychers in warfare before, now they were unquestionably the Psychic Legion. Almost all of their warfare had psychic elements to it, and for his part, Magnus encouraged it. He, being the second most powerful Psyker in the galaxy, he never really learned restraint when it came to the warp. There was no warp beast that he could not slay, no entity that he could not best with his psychic might. Or so it seemed for now at least. Magnus was a huge nerd and taught his sons to value knowledge above pretty much all else. If there was a library on a world, the Thousand Sons would guard it with their lives, which often built animosity between them and other legions, as when, say, the Space Wolves were fighting and dying, the 15th were reading and preserving. This would all come to a head during the Agoru Compliance. The 15th would do their job and then would stay on the planet far longer than usual. They would discover a portal into the Eldar's webway, and of course would be pretty excited about this. But throughout almost their whole time on Agoru, the Space Wolves had been waiting for them in the Arc Reach cluster. Russ would send a contingent to tell the 15th to hurry it up, and after their discovery, the Thousand Sons would head to help the Wolves and the Word Bearers. The Arc-Reach cluster was a rough place to be, even for the Space Wolves, with the Imperium having to invent a few new pieces of weaponry to keep up with the system's creatures. The Thousand Sons arrived on the world of Shrike and would assist the Wolves, but during the battle for Phoenix Crag, the tension between the legions boiled over and a couple Wolves attacked the 15th. They would be dispatched pretty quickly, but during it, a Marine would succumb to the flesh change. Magnus would seemingly try to help his son, when Leman Russ shot and killed the mutated Marine. The Wolf King was kinda hacked off at the 15th's tardiness and their general use of the warp, and he'd had enough. War would have broken out between the two legions if it weren't for Lorgar butting in and calming things down, but Russ would still swear a blood oath against Magnus and his legion, promising that there would one day be a reckoning between them. The Thousand Sons would leave the Wolves to finish the fight in the system and would continue doing their thing, but turns out that other legions, namely the Imperial Fists, Space Wolves, Death, and Raven Guard, had been hounding the Emperor to do something about the Thousand Sons, with many requesting for the Wolves to be sent to destroy them, as is assumed happened with the 2nd and 11th Legions. The Emperor rather would call the Council of Nikaea, or as some call it, the Trial of Magnus, to work this all out. Each authority of the Imperium were there or represented, and the Thousand Sons were called to attend as well. Magnus would make his case of warp knowledge being a light shown to humanity who would rather stay in the dark, and the Space Wolves and Mortarion would share their opposing perspectives. After hearing what everyone had to say, the Emperor would enact his edict, ceasing operations of the Librarians and all warp use outside of travel in the legions, promising his wrath would follow any who disobeyed him. Almost like clockwork, while leaving Nikaea, disappointed at the outcome, Magnus would have a vision showing him of Horus's injury upon Davin and his fate, which would soon follow. Hurrying back to Prospero, the Primarch would begin laying out a way to contact his brother and warn him. Many Psykers would die to do it, but Magnus would project himself into Horus's comatose mind and try to convince him that he was being tricked, but the War Master, thanks to Erebus of the Wordbearers and his own pride, would not listen and cast his brother out. Since that plan had failed, Magnus would instead decide to once again break the Emperor's edict and project himself to Terra to warn his father. While his astral form traveled through the warp, he would find a shortcut through the webway to get to Terra, but it was sealed off and he couldn't break into it. It was then that a warp entity offered its power to help Magnus break through, which he accepted. As Magnus shattered the seal, he found himself in the Imperial throne room on Terra, with the Emperor looking none too pleased. It was then that Magnus would realize his folly. He had broken into the Emperor's webway project and opened a gaping hole for demons to pour onto Terra itself. Enraged, the Emperor would cast his son out and not really listen to what he had to say, and would send the Space Wolves to capture Magnus and bring him to Terra for judgment. But along the way, a now corrupted Horus would receive the order and would instead tell Rust and the Wolves to kill Magnus and destroy Prospero. The Six would arrive at the world and would try to contact Magnus, but he wasn't really answering, so they would begin bombarding the world and would start killing the Thousand Sons. Magnus initially saw this as just, seeing that he needed to atone for his actions, but as he watched his planet be destroyed, the warp entity that assisted him began to speak with him. Spoilers, the entity is Tzeentch, and he would reveal that Magnus had played right into its hands. Tzeentch had, to at least some degree, afflicted the flesh change, and had manipulated Magnus into destroying the Emperor's work on Terra. He was also the entity that had temporarily stopped the flesh change, and now as they fought the Space Wolves, the Thousand Sons began mutating once again. Magnus, enraged and disappointed at his own arrogance, would stride forth and try to save the remainder of his sons. Meeting Leman Russ in a duel, the two Primarchs fought, and despite receiving some injuries, Russ would break Magnus's back over his knee, shattering both his body and his soul. The Thousand Sons and their dying Primarch would be transported into the warp to the planet of the Sorcerers, where it was discovered that Magnus's shattered soul was slowly killing the Primarch. Ahriman would gather enough shards to stabilize his father, but it would be discovered that the last shard had landed on Terra. For this reason, and the Wolves' destruction, Magnus would align himself with Horus, and when the War Master laid siege to the throne world, he would head there himself. Magnus would sneak into the Imperial dungeons and would be met by Malcador the Sigillite, who revealed that his shard had been found and used to create the first Grey Knight. Enraged, Magnus would kill Malcador and change his mission to instead assault the Golden Throne. Approaching the throne, the Emperor would have tried to convince his son to return to him, and even revealed his plan to his son, showing him the future the Emperor had intended, where humanity would live within the Imperial Webway as a fully psychic race powered by Magnus upon the Golden Throne, where he would be privy to all the secrets of the universe. Magnus was tempted to return until the Emperor would reveal that the 15th Legion would have to be destroyed. The flesh change was too deep within them to survive, but there was a new legion for Magnus to lead in their stead. Magnus, however, would not betray his sons and rejected his father's offer, lunging to kill him. But he would be stopped by Vulcan, who, being a perpetual and a lot stronger than his nerd brother, wouldn't have too much trouble dealing with him. But before Vulcan could kill him, Magnus would pledge himself fully to Tzeentch and ascend to become a demon Primarch before being kicked out by the Emperor's anti-chaos wards. Now a winged demon of Tzeentch, Magnus and his sons would spend most of the siege of Terra within the Webway, enacting spells to weaken the Emperor's seals. Vulcan wasn't about to let that happen, though, and went to deal with his demonic brother. Had it been any other Primarch, Magnus would have won, as he killed Vulcan multiple times, but being a Perpetual, he kept coming back. Eventually, Vulcan beat down his brother, and as he raised his hammer to kill him, Magnus unleashed a spell, undoing Vulcan on the genetic level. But it was too late for the Primarch. As his body deteriorated, Vulcan's great hammer fell on Magnus's head, killing him and sending him back into the warp, causing the Thousand Sons to break and flee from Terra. Post-Horus Heresy, the Thousand Sons returned to the planet of the Sorcerers, with the Flesh Change still decimating their ranks. Ahriman, disappointed with his father's inaction, would take curing it into his own hands, and with a cabal of other sorcerers would cast a spell that turned all but the most powerful among the Thousand Sons' bodies to dust, leaving their souls trapped in their armor to act as mindless automata. Technically, this cured the Flesh Change, as your flesh can't change if you don't have any. Ahriman, who didn't know what the spell would do before he cast it, wasn't happy with the result, but Magnus was enraged and almost killed his son. But Tzeentch would save Ahriman from his father, forbidding the Primarch from killing him. Instead, Magnus would exile Ahriman, but gave him an order to learn all of the secrets of chaos, it's believed, in order to one day free the 15th from Tzeentch. Ahriman's current goal is to reverse the rubric he cast, and he seeks the Black Library in order to learn how to do so. A little while later, in the 32nd millennium, the now dusty Thousand Sons would decide to finally get revenge against the Space Wolves. They would appear above Fenris with the goal of destroying the Wolves' gene seed stockpiles to prevent them from creating any new successor chapters. After 40 days of battle, the Great Wolf Huruk Ironhelm would duel the demonic Primarch and would actually manage to injure him, but Magnus was eventually able to beat the Marine down and kill him. Believing that this invasion was simply to destroy their fortress monastery, Ironhelm died knowing that the Space Wolves had managed to retake it, but Magnus knew better. The Thousand Sons had destroyed the Wolves' gene seed stockpiles and ruined their hopes for future recruits, at least for a while, and they would withdraw considering the Battle of the Fang a victory for them. The 15th would be pretty inactive until the 41st millennium when they attacked the Wolves again. Man, they really don't like the Wolves. Can't imagine why though. They would form chaos cults on Fenris, which would allow Magnus to manifest in the Materium and steal the Spear of Russ. They'd be stopped by Ragnar Blackmane, who in the process would lob the spear into Magnus's eye as he emerged from a warp portal. Although it hadn't gone exactly as planned, Magnus now had the spear, and he would devise a plan to use it to corrupt the Space Wolves' Canis Helix gene and turning them all into Wolfen. But again, this would be stopped by Ragnar, who was able to recover his father's spear. Magnus would again emerge in the late 41st millennium. Guess where? That's right, on Fenris. But unlike all the other times, Logan Grimnar was there, and using the Kornite Axe of Morkai, he would banish the Primarch back into the warp, with even Korn himself laughing at the demon. But in a very Tzeentchian twist, this was all a distraction, as Magnus had used the destruction of a nearby world to fuel a warp portal through which the planet of the Sorcerers would emerge into real space. This would allow Magnus and his sons to remain in real space rather than returning to the warp, and it tore a hole in real space through which demons could pour through. Shortly after this, Magnus would detect the resurrection of Rabute Gilliman. The Crimson King would excitedly issue orders to his sons, and soon they would encounter the 13th Primarch. Magnus would ensnare Gilliman's ship and pull them into the warp, trapping them inside what was essentially a massive maze, with a warp gate exit facing Terra. Gilliman would realize that Magnus wanted him to escape so that he could follow them to Terra and with its defenses down, strike it, and so he would instead head to Luna, Terra's moon. The two Primarchs would duel, with Gilliman actually doing pretty well for himself for once. Thanks to reinforcements of the Custodes and Sisters of Silence, Gilliman would hurl the Crimson King into a closing warp gate, trapping him and saving Terra from his ambitions. The Thousand Sons' most recent activity was when Tzeentch got jealous of Nurgle's plague stars and wanted a domain of real space for himself. The 15th would take a sector of the Imperium rife with warp storms, and there they wait, presumably scheming for their next action in the Great Game. So that pretty much brings us up to speed on the 15th. When it comes to tactics, the Thousand Sons, before their fall, fought like standard Space Marines, but with a metric ton of psychic shenanigans. I would actually say that they were one of the physically less capable legions due to the fact that they focused most of their efforts on training their warp-born skills rather than dueling. Magnus was one of the physically weaker Primarchs, and so I think that translates to his sons as well, with them just not being on the same level as some of the other legions in terms of physical warfare and prowess. After their fall, they pretty much dove only into sorcery, as champions of Tzeentch aren't exactly known for their hand-to-hand skills. Most of the time, if you can get into dueling range with a Tzeentch follower, outside of like a Zongor or something, that means their plan isn't going well, as they would much rather melt your mind than cut your head off. The Thousand Sons Legion culture and structure were pretty unique. They were divided into 9 fellowships, which were limited to, I think, about 10,000 Marines each, and within these fellowships were cults, each with a specific focus. The 5 main ones were 1. The Athenaean, who were essentially the 15th's communications department, using telepathy to send and receive messages. 2. The Corvidae, who were in charge of seeing the future and determining courses of action from it. 3. The Pavoni, who were the physical specialists of the 15th, serving as both doctors and on occasion altering enemies' bodies as a form of warfare. 4. The Pyri, who liked fire. Yeah, that's it. They're just the pyrotechnics division of the 15th. And 5. The Raptora, who were telekinesis specialists. There were other cults, of course, but these are the main ones that you need to know about. The Thousand Sons to me are one of the greatest lessons in knowledge versus wisdom that I've ever seen. They were an undeniably intelligent legion with them constantly seeking old artifacts and books to learn from, but eventually it became learning for the sake of learning, without a specific goal in mind. Everything they learned, they immediately started implementing it without inspecting and devising from where or who it came from. Wisdom would be to seek knowledge eagerly, but temper it with caution. But the 15th, and especially Magnus, never had the wherewithal to assume that there was stuff they didn't know and forces that could be conspiring against them. And this brings me to my second point. The Thousand Sons' greatest stumbling block was arrogance. Now, don't get me wrong, all of the legions are arrogant. Being sons of demigods that can level mountains will do that to you. But the 15th took it to another level. Magnus legitimately believed that there was nothing in the warp that he couldn't best, even when the Emperor explicitly warned him to the contrary. Magnus was that one guy we all know that regularly speeds, but never got caught. Until that one time he did, for going 90 in a school zone. By the time Magnus realized just how large the warp really was and how complex it could be, it was too late and the Space Wolves were already knocking on his door. The Thousand Sons are one of the biggest wastes of potential in all of 40k. They were one of the most powerful legions, and Magnus was literally designed to eventually sit on the Golden Throne and pretty much save all of humanity. If he had just paid a little more heed to his father's words and not gone poking around with things he didn't understand, he could have ushered in a golden age for humanity. But instead he kept drinking the Kool-Aid, seeking knowledge without the wisdom to utilize it properly. And Ahriman. Man, I like Ahriman as a character, but this guy is as delusional as the day is long. Where other Chaos Legions just go whole hog into serving their god, the Thousand Sons, but Ahriman specifically, have somehow convinced themselves that they aren't servants of Tzeentch and that they still can outsmart the god of knowledge, trickery, and sorcery from which all their power flows. I mean, seriously, how many times does fate have to smack you in the nuts before you learn some humility? And also, he lost against the Ynnari. That's just embarrassing. And of course, being a Tzeentch faction, every time they lose, there's always talk of, oh, this is all according to plan, the changer of ways knows all. But like, according to who? Tzeentch, the god of trickery? Yeah, like I'm going to listen to him. Now don't get me wrong, I understand that the Thousand Sons story is to some degree a tragedy. From their inception, they were preyed upon by forces outside of their control, and the Emperor definitely withheld somewhat essential knowledge from Magnus. But at some point, you gotta acknowledge that these guys were just arrogant idiots that continued to turn up the radio to ignore the sounds their car was making. People give the Space Wolves a lot of crap for burning Prospero, and some of it's definitely deserved, but honestly, I'm surprised it didn't happen sooner. Magnus just straight up ignored the Emperor on pretty much everything he said and blew a hole into humanity's only hope. I wouldn't say Magnus did everything wrong, but when it comes to the current state of the galaxy, for humanity at least, I think you can split the blame and lay it at the feet of him and the Emperor. And not just that, but Leman Russ actually tried to contact Magnus so he could surrender, but he was too busy pouting in his room to pick up the phone. Overall, the Thousand Sons are just a legion that I know went through a rough time, but one that I can't really bring myself to feel bad for. Maybe it's the Canis Helix in me that prevents it, I don't know. But what do y'all think of the Thousand Sons? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and be sure to check out my community tab where I'm pretty active. And with all that said, I'll see y'all later.